tour dialogue, and there's lots of information there specifically, but it's basically a way to connect with people of other faiths, other worldviews in our city. So the information is there if you're interested in that. Pastor Josh can also answer more questions about that. And biggest thing going on that we have next Sunday, if you really want to be here, if you can be, it's our Vision Sunday weekend. It's kind of the kickoff to our ministry year together. We celebrate what has been going really well. We look forward to what's to come. We're having ice cream and popcorn afterwards. Kids and families will have an opportunity to meet Sunday school teachers after service as well. And we're going to talk a little bit about all the great feedback that we got from the survey. So we hope that you can all make it. It's a great weekend to invite someone who you've been thinking like, they might like this, they might like our community. There might be something here for them. They kind of catch a vision of our overarching scope and why we do what we do. So it'd be a good opportunity for that. And check out the rest of those announcements, and we're going to go ahead and move forward with our scripture reading.
This morning's passage comes to us from Luke 15, verses 1 through 7 from the New Living Translation. Tax collectors and other notorious sinners often came to listen to Jesus teach. This made the Pharisees and teachers of religious law complain that he was associating with such sinful people, even eating with them. So Jesus told them this story. If a man has 100 sheep and one of them gets lost, what will he do? Won't he leave the 99 others in the wilderness and go to search for the one that is lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he will joyfully carry it home on his shoulders. When he arrives, he will call together his friends and neighbors, saying, "Rejoice with me, because I have found my lost sheep." In the same way, there is more joy in heaven over one lost sinner who repents and returns to God than over 99 others who are righteous and haven't strayed away. This is the word of the Lord.
Just wanted to apologize for the fact that screens aren't working still. We are, with this screen over here, we are still diligently working on what seems like a demon in the projector. I actually think it's Legion. I think there's 10 of them. Because poor Dustin has spent so much time trying to figure out how to fix that. So hopefully we'll get that figured out soon. But thanks for your grace and patience as we continue to try to do that. So what are our thoughts about this morning's passage on the one sheep who wandered away from the 100, or the 99? Thoughts, comments, sonnets, songs, poems, concerns? Yes, Caleb. A little bit louder, sorry, Caleb. People have always hated tax collectors because they're an annoyance. And they knock on your doors, yes. Yes, very explosive imagination. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. That's right, Caleb. People don't like tax collectors because, well, they take your money, right? What else? Chantal.
I think it's a beautiful image, the fact that the 99 sheep are considered safe, partly because they're in community with each other.
Yeah. Feel safe because they're in community with one another. Yeah. That is the comfort of a herd, isn't it? Right? Yes.
Jesus leaves nobody behind.
Jesus leaves nobody behind no matter what. Yeah. Yep.
What if that one is 99 lost?
Gerald, one more time.
What about when the 99 are lost?
What about when the 99 are lost? Yeah, there's a point. Who is the 99 in the story? Who is he telling the story to in this passage? It's something to think about. What else? Yes, Justin.
All sheep matter.
All sheep matter. Yeah. All sheep matter. We may have a new Imago shirt coming on. What else? Yes.
I would just say a thankfulness that there's definitely been times where I felt like the one. Felt like that I was not finding my way back to God, that it didn't come to me and still be back where I'm supposed to go.
Yeah.
Back to that comfort and understanding.
Yeah, I love that you said that sometimes it feels like God found you and you didn't find God in some way, which I think is interesting because Christina's, when she shared her sermon last week, she talked about the prodigal son in the story, or maybe she would refer to as the faithful God or the loving God who is consistent no matter what, right? And then you also have the story that's also popped in here with this same story of the sheep, of the lost coin, right? The coin and the son, or the coin and the sheep somebody goes and tries to find them, right? But the son comes home. No one goes to find the son. And I think that there's no coincidence that you have both in that set of parables, that there are some that is going to search, and there are some that realizing that the search is actually just going to drive them further away. And so the father waits for the son to come home, knowing that he's set a precedent that surely the son would know he could come home, right? What else? Yes, in the back.
It's been said that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one, and I believe in this case it's in reverse.
Yeah.
That the needs of the one may outweigh the needs of the many.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Sam.
It's really interesting to me, like, this is part of our theme for camp, but anyway, so that one sheep, so like the shepherd knows each one of the sheep by name or by face, like there's a difference between each one, so it's not like there's just one out of the 100 that's missing. If it's a very specific one, that's very loved, and so it's like, there's that love and that pull towards that one sheep, so it's not like, oh, I'm abandoning all 99 to go search for this one, like, I want to make sure that these are safe while I search for that one and bring it back home. So it's just like part of your family's being brought back home. It's not just one
Yeah.
of many.
I like that because sometimes there's a narrative like, well, does he not care about the 99? He just leaves them. It's like, well, no, we don't know that he has secured the 99, right, to go and get the one because that one's so important to him. Sure. What else?
Talk about whether they're being sought or whether they wait to come back home. There's a celebration every time when they come home or when they're found.
Yeah.
In either case, it doesn't matter whether they came with their own free will or they were found. There's still a celebration.
Yeah. There's still a celebration. Yeah. Celebration is key to today's message. I want us to pick up on that. What else? Anything else? Yes.
I'm just really irritated by I love the story of this, but I get caught up in that lost sheep language because so often in my evangelical upbringing, people use that as, oh, you're just a lost sheep. So it's really hard for me to get past personally just that language, thinking about it and
Yeah, that's a good word. Yeah, Libby, I grew up evangelical too, so I was triggered by this when I read it to write the sermon. I was like, ugh, lost. That word was just used in such a negative way. And I grew up evangelical but extreme Calvinist, where we believed that God had picked some people to be lost to go to hell, so that the people who were chosen going to heaven would feel better about it. Like, oh, see, this is something to be grateful for because those people are going to hell. We were chosen for this good thing. And if someone's not going to hell, then you're not going to be grateful for it. Yikes, language, right? That's an extreme. So where is this place where we can find a redemption to this word in the middle ground that maybe feels that it uplifts the character of God that we've come to see in a full picture? What else? Yes.
This is a little bit of a twist, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it's just based on my own thoughts, experiences. What if those 99 sheep, if the sheep flock as a whole was the church, for example, what if the other 99 sheep did something or said something to drive away that one sheep from the church?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And I think that, can you tell me your name? I haven't got to meet you yet. Jamie. I think that there's a lot of people here at Imago that are that one sheep who got chased away by the 99, who had some really sharp teeth. And I think that though that the one who wanders sometimes can also find a flock of another 99 and add 2, right?
Yes.
And at the same time, that new flock can sometimes be throwing rocks at the flock over there that chased them out, instead of saying, hey, can we be a flock of 200? You know, like, and what can we share and what can we do together, right?
Right.
And I come out of a background of so much trauma attached to that sometimes I'm like, well, I just don't want anything to do with those people anymore because it's going to trigger me. No. How can I work through my own stuff
Exactly.
so that I can still be in communion with that person?
Being angry with God.
Instead of just,
Yeah.
right, because well, I love what you said. You said that you become angry with, or not you, but this hypothetical sheep, has become angry with God because of the way the 99 is cast out, and now you're angry with God. Instead of perhaps one thing we could reframe it, we could say, maybe I'm angry with the way that they presented God to me,
Yes.
right? And that can be a shift, one that has to take part in our own hearts, and we have to do our own work for it. But it's tough, so I'm with you, I'm tracking with you. And so a great segue then into our passage, because I think that this mindset we should keep as we think about the beginning part of this passage, which sets the stage for who the story is being told to, right? Who Jesus is telling the parable to is always important for context. So beginning in very first verse of Luke chapter 15, he says, tax collectors and other notorious sinners often came to listen to Jesus teach. Verse 2, this made the Pharisees and teachers of religious law complain that he was associating with such sinful people, even eating with them. So Caleb mentioned earlier tax collectors, and the reason that tax collectors were so despised was because they were cheating people, and they were contributing to the systemic issues around generational poverty. And the Jewish people particularly would not like tax collectors because oftentimes tax collectors were the Jewish people. The Roman government would come and say, hey, we would like for you to be a tax collector. And by asking them to do that, they knew that by saying, yes, I'll be a tax collector, they were going to be able to line their pockets a little bit more, they'd be a little bit more wealthy. But at the same time, they would be giving up their family and their religious heritage and their social circles for some money. And so they would go and they would collect money, and they would overcharge, they would upcharge. So they'd take a portion to give to the government, and then they would upcharge and keep that rest for themselves. And that was how they'd make their pay. So they were just like a really sly waitress who did the extra gratuity and brings you the bill, and it's like 50% tip based off of you're like, what, 50? Well, sorry, we just do the instant gratuity. You don't get to decide. That's how we do it here, right? And so this is what tax collectors are doing, right? They're just giving themselves this exorbitant amount of extra, and they line their pockets, and then who hates them? The people who they're stealing money from, who often were the very people whom they turn their backs on to be able to get ahead. So this is why tax collectors are like picked out and despised among the rest. So then it says, right, other notorious sinners. Commentary by Luke Earl, he says that the Pharisees' term for sinners was those who would not keep ceremonial regulation laid down by the rabbis. So if you didn't keep all the laws and the rules that you were supposed to, guess what? You were a sinner. And I think that's important to remember that they didn't consider themselves sinners because they felt that they had kept all the rules just right. That they had laid down. And so there were people who didn't keep the rules and people who did. But reality is Jesus comes, I think, time and time again, to help the Pharisees see, you're a sinner too. Who do you think you are that you're not a sinner? Just because you think you keep the rules most of the time, or 99% of the time, or you think you've got this all figured out. And Jesus is constantly trying to draw them back to that, but they just can't see their need for grace. Here's an interesting quote here by someone in our congregation, anonymous. We must be careful that we don't view this as directed as those Pharisees, someone other than ourselves. The Pharisees constituted the religious establishment of that day, being the church. We are the religious establishment of our day. Let us not think that somehow those Pharisees, but let us remember we are the religious establishment of Western culture in Christianity in America today. Okay? And so because we're comfortable and we have the dominant voice, we are the Pharisee. We are the place of privilege and power. And it's easy for us to then go us and them instead of us for them. And you create this great tension when you do that. May we remember this morning that this message, these parables are for the Pharisees, and guess who else also has a tendency to be the Pharisee? Who is the Pharisee? It is the person who is in dominant power, who is in control, the person who is in a place of privilege, a place of comfortability, the person who thinks, oh, I'm secure, I'm good with God, we're fine. That's a place of privilege. It's the older son who thinks, I've done everything right, and I've always been faithful to the Father, unlike my younger brother who went off, did silly things, and came back, and my dad forgave him. I never did that. I'm good. And I don't have to go above and beyond for my dad to like me. I can just, I've just done this, and that should be good enough. Thinking that you can earn the love of God by somehow doing. This is the heart of a Pharisee. And here's the thing I think is most important in our passage then to catch with this. The Pharisees believed that God separated God's self from anyone that was sinful. That God would not be in the presence of someone who was sinful, right? That God would set God's self apart, and in many ways, this idea that the Jews were called to be set apart from other people who were sinful and wrong. And so the Pharisees, in their minds, is if you're sinful, we don't associate with you because my God doesn't associate with you. And so this is exactly what they're doing. And they're like, well, Jesus, if you say you're of God, and you are clean, and you are good, why would you be associating with someone that God doesn't even associate with? See the separation in their minds? Jesus is trying to call them back to view this in a different way. Here at Imago, one of our directives that we'll talk more about next week on Vision Sunday is that a part of our mission directive is a line in there that says that we honor, respect, and partner with other organizations that may be different than us in order to serve the community. I think it's really important for us to remember that there are organizations in our community that are doing good work, but we don't ask, now what is your 10-point doctrinal statement so that we know that, we agree with everything you do before we choose to partner with you or to give you money or to provide food for the food pantry or to provide clothes for Family Corps. Or are you a Christian organization? Because we only partner with Christian organizations. We wouldn't partner with anyone else other than someone who believes that Jesus Christ died, was buried, and resurrected. If you don't do that, then those other people, their needs just can't be met. Sorry, we're just not going to do it. We don't do that here. Part of the foundation of this church was built on the idea that we would partner with people for needs to be met, not for there to be uniformity with all of the systems that we partner with. One of the examples of this that I asked some folks who've been a part of Imago for a while, and one of the things that came out in our survey was that people love that we do Breakfast Club. They love that we do Breakfast Club. A ministry on Sunday mornings that serves those who are experiencing homelessness by just serving a meal and having conversation and just building life and relationship with them. And folks who sometimes, one of the things I love to share with people when I talk about Imago is that we do it on Sunday morning. Because unfortunately, there isn't a service like that on Sunday morning, and how pathetic would it be that people are starving on Sunday because people are worshiping. Churches don't have time for it on Sunday because they're in worship. And Imago has chosen to make it a priority. This is a busy day for us, and the pastors have allowed our place on those days, and folks coming on Sunday morning. It's hard enough to get folks to come on at 9 a.m. for a service, let alone get up at 5, 6, 7 a.m. to come and serve and to be a part of meeting needs for folks. But Imago does it. And the way Imago started Breakfast Club, which is, I think, really fascinating, is there was a woman who was serving a meal out of her car by the Gateway building. And Imago decided, hey, if you need a space to do this, you can serve these out of our church office. And so they started serving the meals out of the church office. And then all of a sudden, after some time, this sort of just meshed together. And Breakfast Club became a ministry that we did with this woman who started this thing out of her car. And what I think is most beautiful, when I was asking questions about where we got started, somebody said, when we decided to help this lady who was serving meals out of her car to those who were experiencing homelessness, we didn't ask her, now, are you a Christian? And do you believe these things right here? And what is your end goal, your mission? It was just people are hungry. We have hands and we have a space. Let's meet the need. And I think that Jesus in the beginning of this story is trying to help the Pharisees and religious leaders see something. That if you have a mindset of those people are sinners, those people are unclean, those people don't agree with us, those people don't think like we do, those people don't believe like we do, those people don't align with us, so we're not going to associate with them, you're not catching the heart of God. You're not really loving God and loving neighbor as God's called you to. And Jesus is calling them to see, you are just as much of a sinner and just as much in need of grace and God's love as anyone else you come across. He's trying to help them tear down these divides that exist. And I can bet your bottom dollar that folks who come on Sunday morning to serve with Breakfast Club, they get just as much out of those whom they're serving with and alongside as those who come on Sunday morning. It's a mutual partnership. Because at any time you go and you think, I'm going to do this thing and you can't give me anything, well, I think you become a Pharisee. But when you serve folks and you love folks and you walk alongside them in such a way that you realize there's a mutuality on both sides and you both have something to bring, I think then you catch the heart of Jesus. And exactly what Jesus is trying to do. He's trying to tear down this wall that the religious leaders and Pharisees today have built up between them and sinners, so that it would not be them and sinners, but it would just be us, the beloved. One of the other things I love that we do that is an example of this tearing down of walls is our youth, the last couple of years, part of what's called, I always say it wrong, Chrysalis, there it is, thank you. They I just looked right at you, you just knew, you were ready, and then he just stole it from you. Part of our youth and our Chrysalis program, which is in some ways our equivalent to like a confirmation for our youth. Time for just spiritual formation. Not necessarily a time for them to confirm their faith, but to explore their faith. As well as to explore the faiths of others. And to compare that against what they've learned and taught here. So one of the things they do is they'll go to different churches on a Sunday morning and experience different faiths and experiences and thoughts and forms of worship and theology. And then they'll come back and they'll talk about it. What did you think about that? How did you believe? How did you experience that? Had you ever heard that before? I love that. Because the minute you say, don't go there, you've closed off the conversation. They're going to go there at some point, right? They're going to hear about a worldview and an idea and a belief maybe that you didn't want your child to believe or think. At some point, why not have it now when we can have a conversation about it? Why not now when we can be a part of their spiritual formation and development? Why are we trying to protect and silo and draw lines? It's exactly what the Pharisees did. And Jesus was all about erasing that line in the sand. Let's keep on with this story here. In verse 3 it says, so Jesus told them this story. If a man has 100 sheep and one of them gets lost, what will he do? Won't he leave the 99 others in the wilderness and go search for the one that is lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he will joyfully carry it home on his shoulders. And when he arrives, he will call all together his friends, his neighbors, saying, rejoice with me, because I have found my lost sheep. And when I picture the lost sheep and Jesus, I think of this picture that I hung in my grandma's house. I just immediately go to this very European, white, bright-eyed, blue-eyed, beautiful. Clearly, Jesus has a curler, blow dryer hair, well-bathed. Definitely getting the pedicure. Look at those hands. Those are beautiful hands. Those are not carpenter hands, all right? Those are beautiful hands. I picture this Jesus just cuddling the sheep. Clearly has access to Clorox bleach for that beautiful white gown. This is who I picture in my head, because this is when I grew up. This was on my wall in my grandma's house in my bedroom that I was supposed to stay in. I stared at this precious Jesus all the time. So whenever I see Jesus in my head, I don't think of a bronze-skinned Galilean Nazarene guy who's kind of been in the midst of it, right? And he's been in the trenches. He hasn't been in a place of privilege and power and prestige and money. This guy doesn't even have a place to lay his head. He was born in a trough, like this. But this is how we've done and made Jesus in our own image. And I want us to know that if this is how you see Jesus, cool. That's cool. That's cool. I'm glad. But if this is how you view Jesus, and it then affects the way in which you view Jesus as being a person who puts himself up here, looking down, as if Jesus who somehow tried to place himself in this great place of privilege and power and prestige, instead of a Jesus who would often come down and look at folks in their eyes and not stand on the steps of the temple and preach down at people, but instead go into their homes, go to their streets and call people out of trees and go into their homes and dine them. Instead of calling them to the temple, he would go to them. He would go into the wilderness and the field to find the one, and not the masses who were gathered in the large temples. The Jesus who came down, who got dirty, and associated with people who the religious elite said were dirty. And at the same time, when the religious elite would come to him, because they had to go to him to find him, right? And time again, it's like the religious elite made a journey to find him. They were often. Did he just say, oh, puss, we're done with you, whatever, get away? Jesus didn't dismiss them. He always engaged them. He asked them questions. He listened. He told them stories to make them consider. Jesus also viewed them just as much in need of him. They just didn't view themselves in need of him. Jesus engaged because they too were the one who had wandered away from the 99. I think it's interesting to think in the handbook of sheep, how to herd sheep, there's a story told, and it talks about the death of 400 sheep in 2016 who in eastern Turkey, the sheep plunged to their own death after one sheep, the main sheep who was leading the herd, tried to cross a 15-meter deep ravine, and the rest of the flock followed, and so did their deaths. One sheep wandering, and the rest going, we should follow that one there. All of them. Shocking. Yet so often, I think, as I mentioned earlier in the discussion time, to not follow the one who's leading, I think some of them would have thought, well, will I be the one left behind? If I don't follow the group, even unto their death, will I be alone? And how fearful would that be? And I think for so many of us in this room, I know myself included, I remember what it felt like to leave a belief system and to wander off on my own when I saw the people that I knew so comfortably and had grown so fond of, and the religious leaders that I had followed my whole life keep going, and me decide, I'm not going to cross that ravine this time. And to feel isolated and alone and confused and unsure, as you said earlier, well, where do I go now? What do I do now? And in many ways, I would say finding Imago is like finding a new flock. Because honestly, after the religious leaders that I had followed all my life walked across the ravine and left, and some who they would say I am dead to them, I thought, I'll probably never pastor again. I'll probably never find a church that is open to diversity of thought and opinion, that values my diverse background in worship expression and theological perspective, and I'll probably never find a church. And it did. And I know after talking to so many of you and reading the surveys, that's your stories too. And I'm grateful for it. And for some of you, a shepherd found you and brought you in. And others of you just wandered home after being gone in the wayward land for a while. And you were happy to find a parent, a divine parent with arms open to say, welcome home. I think for many of us, coming home was great joy. In verse 7 of this story, it says, in the same way, there is more joy in heaven over the one lost sinner who repents and returns to God than over 99 others who are righteous and haven't strayed away. I think it's interesting that he mentions this. The Pharisees have a hard time being happy about the one who comes home. Just like the older brother had a hard time with the one who came home. Just like Jonah had a hard time when he saw the grace of God extended to the Ninevites after he preached to them. There was something about like this extravagant grace and love of God to people who they don't feel deserves it, and they feel they deserve it, that makes them angry. Makes them unhappy to have joy. And Jesus in his story is saying, listen, I know you're not happy that these folks have come home because you don't think they deserve it, and you think that that's unfair, that they get to do all this, and God forgives them, and you've been so good and followed the rules and polished and didn't do too many negative things in your life, and they get the same grace that you did. But guess what? Just like the older son, just like Jonah, you too cannot rejoice over this happy day. But heaven, my God, he rejoices on this day. For when just one comes home, who's been cast out or wandered away. Repentance is not the cause of God's love, but the result of God's love, James R. Edwards says. And I think in our final time together, I want to paint us now this picture that I think is really important to understand what lost means and what it looks like to be found. I don't know if you've ever heard of this before, but I want to show you this little chart. When we sin, we experience either sin and separation or shame and estrangement. Let me explain this to you. Sin and separation, shame and estrangement. So, sin and separation. Adam and Eve in the garden. They disobey God. God comes to them in the garden, right? God says to them, where are you? Adam and Eve are hiding. And in that place, God calls them out. Why are you hiding? Well, we're naked. We messed up. We did what you told us we shouldn't have done. Well, why are you hiding? Come out from behind the bush. And then in the end of Genesis 3, it says that God kills an animal and takes it and places that skin on them, gives them clothes to cover their shame so they can come out from behind the bush and be in God's presence. Here's what I was told my whole life. I was told that because I sinned, God can't see me. God doesn't want anything to do with me. God and I can't be in the same room. Because God's disgusted by my sin. My sin separates me from God. And when I'm living in sin, God doesn't want to be around me because God is righteous and God can't be in the room with sin. Same thing the Pharisees thought about why they couldn't associate with sinners. I believed that my whole life. And so anytime I would sin, anytime I struggled with anything, I always felt what? Separated from God. I felt separated from God. But let's think about it like this maybe. Let's just propose that this is another way to think about it. Shame and estrangement. Adam and Eve in the garden. They're hiding behind a bush because they are ashamed of what they've done. And they think there is no way God could ever love us or accept us. There is no way God would ever want to be with us or in our presence. There's no way God would want to even look at me again. She must be disgusted by me. Shameful. But the beautiful thing about this story is that Adam and Eve didn't have to do anything to get God to come to them in the garden. If God didn't want to be with them, God could have just went, well, they messed up, I'm done, I'm going to just stay up here now. But no, God comes to the garden, and he desires for them to be in his presence so much that she kills a sheep or an animal of some sort and uses that to clothe them so that their shame will be no longer, so they can be in God's presence. And we see this story even in a more clear way played out in the prodigal son. We see this story of a son who was messed up just like Adam and Eve, who is ashamed of what he has done and thinks, I will go home and I will tell my dad, Dad, I am so sorry. Just take me back as one of your hired hands. I don't even have to be a son anymore. Just take me back as a servant. It'll be better than the way I've been living. So estranged from his father because of the shame he has experienced. And so he comes back to his dad, and his dad's like, I love you. You're not going to be a hired hand. You're my kid. You are welcomed home. And oh no, there's no way. No. You can't do that. I have a whole speech prepared for you, and there's no way that you would accept me, and I've messed up so much, and how could you ever forgive me? I'm so ashamed. I couldn't even be taken back as your son. There's no way. And Adam and Eve hiding behind a bush, so ashamed, so disgusted with themselves, coming out, quivering behind a bush to be in the presence of God, unsure of what God will do. God spends the rest of human history rolling out a plan of how in which God can still be in community with his beloved. And we see this climax in the story of the prodigal son. Estrangement is this. Estrangement is, there's no way that God would ever love me. The reality is, God does. God's never separated. You, in your shame, have separated yourself from God because you think God could never love you. Separation says, God is separated from me. Estrangement says, I'm separating myself from God because there's no way God could love me. See the difference? And I want to call us this morning to see that this lost sheep in this story is in so many ways us. Estranged from God, thinking that there's no way that God could ever love me. Or perhaps some of us, it is thinking that of course God would love me. Look at me. And perhaps our eyes need to be opened this morning to know that there's nothing we could ever say, do, ask, or think, or believe that can make God love us any more or any less. It's the belief that we are loved and we are beloved simply because we are children of God, not because of anything else. God does not set up the narrative that God is punishing for sin, but that sin is its own punishment. Sin reaps its own consequences. God's search for the sheep who separated themselves from the flock is no different than the prodigal son story, than the Adam and Eve story. It's a God who comes to them in the garden. It's the God who goes out to the field to find the one lost sheep. It is the God who also sits on the porch and waits for the son to come home. And when the son comes home, embraces that son full-heartedly. Invite the worship team to come. Salvation is the divine gift of remembering who you are, a beloved child of God, not lost, maybe estranged because you think God couldn't love you, but you are found because God loves you no matter what. Some of you may believe that God loves you, but you may think God doesn't actually like you. And rest assured, church, God loves you and God likes you. Why? Because in you, and when God looks at you, you are created in that image, and that is beloved. We may have estranged ourselves from God, but God has never separated God's self from us. God has been the dad waiting on the porch. God has been the divine parent walking in the garden, calling, come out from behind the bush. Stop hiding. See yourself the way I see you. You're my child. We're not going to take communion today, but we will be for the next 7 weeks of the Sacrament series. And when we do, I want us to think about communion like this, perhaps. Consider thinking about communion as a time to be reminded that we aren't estranged. When we come to the table, we are reminded that we are forgiven, we are loved, we are beloved, we are worthy. We are a coin found under a lint-infested pillow. We are a sheep wandering in a cactus-infested land. We are agitated by our separation from God, but now comforted by our safety of an extravagant welcome back home after a journey in a faraway land. Home, church. Home is where God is. Here, our divine parent has welcomed us home and lavished us with signs of love that cover our shame. Here, our divine parent has prepared our favorite meal, dresses us in royalty amidst our disloyalty, and places a ring on our finger to remind us every time we look down in our wayward hands that God has promised to never leave us or forsake us, for even in death we will not part. We are as precious to God as a coin found, a sheep rescued, and a wayward child coming home. Home is God. Home is where I receive the divine gift of remembering who I am, a beloved child of God. As the worship team plays this morning, we're going to just create some room for silence. I'm going to put some questions on the screen. And I just want to create space for us to ponder these questions in our own heart. Just think about them. You may want to take a picture or write them down, take them home with you, but begin the journey of asking these questions to yourself. To figure out, where do you fall on that sin and separation or shame and estrangement spectrum? And what would it mean for you to think about God in a way that perhaps is different than how you were taught? And is this true for you when you read Scripture? Do you see this narrative? Let's create some space and read these questions and just allow some time for quiet reflection for a moment as the team plays in the background. Just take a deep breath in with me. And take a deep breath out. A deep breath in. And a deep breath out. God, we give you thanks for being a God who loves us when we've been rotten or when we've been good, when we've been naughty or when we've been nice. We give thanks that you are a God who through narrative in our most beautiful scriptures shows us the ways in which since the beginning you have been extending grace. You have been a shepherd coming to us in the garden, coming to us in the wilderness. You have been a shepherd waiting on a porch. And when we have estranged ourselves from you, you simply wait for us to come home, to recognize we've always been beloved children of God. When we realize, when we see ourselves the way that you see us, then and only then, God, can we love others in that same way. And so change our hearts, strengthen us for the journey, help us to wrestle with these truths. Help us to love like you love us, so that the world may know us by our love. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. We stand with me as we sing this final song together. As we sang earlier today,